A routine trip to Walmart took a chilling turn when a veteran spotted a little girl clutching a toy, her eyes filled with longing. But when he saw her again outside, being led away by the man she was with, she turned back, just for a second, and waved. That's when he noticed something that made his blood run cold, and he knew he had to act fast. The Texas heat bore down on the asphalt, making the air shimmer above the rows of parked cars. Mitchell Dawson adjusted his cap and glanced at his wife, Vera, as she shifted in her seat. Even in the air-conditioned car, her breathing was labored. "You sure you don't want me to just run in and grab everything?" he asked. Vera shook her head, her usual determination evident in the way she gripped her purse. "No, I need to move around. Sitting too long makes my joints worse." Mitchell knew better than to argue. Vera had always been strong-willed, a fighter, even as her health declined. He nodded, stepping out of the truck and moving to her side to help her down. "Just lock the door when you get in," he reminded her. She gave him a look. "You act like I'm new at this." Mitchell chuckled and held up his hands in surrender. Together, they made their way into Walmart, moving past the cold blast of air that greeted them at the entrance. The store was busy, families loading their carts, kids whining for snacks, an older couple arguing over the price of canned beans. Mitchell guided Vera toward the pharmacy section, but his eyes drifted when they passed the toy aisle. A small figure stood alone near a display of dolls. The black girl, no older than 6, wore a faded Hello Kitty shirt, her blonde hair slightly tangled. She clutched a doll with both hands, fingers tight around its plastic body. There was something about the way she held it, the intensity in her grip, that made Mitchell pause. Her gaze wasn't just longing, it was deeper than that, a kind of silent ache. Mitchell had seen that look before, in soldiers, in men who had lost too much and knew they'd never get it back. The girl blinked up at him, startled, and for a moment he thought she might say something. But then she quickly looked away, lowering her head as though she had done something wrong. Just as he was about to move on, the doll slipped from the girl's fingers. No, not slipped. She had thrown it, intentionally, right at his feet. Mitchell frowned and bent down, picking up the doll. When he straightened, the girl's hands were clenched into tiny fists, gripping the hem of her shirt. Her chest rose and fell quickly, her small frame rigid. Then, before he could say a word, a hand latched onto her wrist. A man. Tall, lean, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Mitchell's body tensed. "I'm sorry about that," the man said, his voice steady but forced. "She's not getting it. Too expensive." The girl's shoulders twitched as if she expected something. The man squeezed her wrist just a little too tight. His grip on the doll tightened. "You sure she doesn't want to pick it up herself?" The man's expression darkened. "I said no." The little girl didn't move, didn't speak. Her eyes flicked toward his. They were wide, too wide for a child. Fear rippled in them, layered beneath something else. A plea. The man yanked her arm. "Come on, we're leaving." The girl swallowed hard and cast one last look at Mitchell, a look that sent a chill down his spine. She hadn't just dropped the doll. She had thrown it. She had chosen him. As Mitchell turned to leave, he caught a fragment of the man's low voice. "Come on, we need to go. Didn't you want to see the new house?" The little girl hesitated. Her small voice barely rose above the hum of the store. Is Mum there?" The man answered too quickly. "Of course she is." Mitchell's steps slowed. Something about the exchange sent a cold prickle down his spine. The girl, her dark skin, her delicate features, didn't seem to match the white man standing beside her. Maybe he is her stepfather. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. Or maybe there wasn't. The look in her eyes lingered in his mind, wide and uncertain, as he made his way toward the pharmacy. His chest tightened with unease. Something wasn't right. The bright lights of Walmart flickered above Mitchell Dawson as he made his way to the pharmacy section. His feet moved out of habit, but his mind was elsewhere. The image of the little girl lingered, her small, trembling fingers clutching the hem of her shirt, the way she had thrown the doll at his feet as if it were a message. Mitchell was not a man prone to paranoia. Years in the military had trained him to recognize real danger from imagined fears. But this gnawed at him. At the counter, he placed Vera's medication on the counter, methotrexate and folic acid, the routine combination for her arthritis. The pharmacist rang them up, and Mitchell forced himself to focus. "That'll be 42, 75, the woman said, sliding the paper bag toward him. Mitchell handed her his card, nodding absent-mindedly. That child. That man. Something wasn't right. As he made his way back toward the exit, his feet carried him past the toy section once more. He wasn't planning on stopping, but his eyes flicked toward the shelf where she had stood. The doll was still there, the same one. A small plastic figure with golden curls, dressed in a pink frilled dress, staring blankly through the clear packaging. It sat on the metal rack, waiting. The price tag read $14.99, crossed out with a bold red sticker beneath it. 20% off. Mitchell hesitated. What were the odds he would see her again? Almost none. And yet, his hand reached out, fingers brushing against the cardboard box. He imagined the way her little hands had clenched as she stared at it. He imagined the way she had looked at him before the man dragged her away. Silent, fearful, pleading. Before he could change his mind, he grabbed the doll and walked toward the checkout. It wasn't about the money. It was about not ignoring the feeling in his gut. Just as he reached the self-checkout, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. Vera. He answered immediately. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, keeping his voice light. "Mitch." Her voice was tired, weak, too weak. "Where are you?" Something in her tone sent a different kind of worry through him. "I'm at the checkout, just about to head out. You okay?" "My joints," she murmured. "They're flaring up bad today." Mitchell's jaw tightened. He should have moved faster. Guilt settled deep in his chest. He was in here, getting lost in his thoughts, letting himself be pulled into something that wasn't his business, while Vera was out there, waiting for him, hurting. "Hang tight," he said quickly. "I'm coming right now." He shoved his phone back in his pocket, scanning the doll along with Vera's medicine. He had no time for distractions. His duty was to his wife. That was the only thing that mattered. As he turned away from the self-checkout, something in the corner of his eye stopped him cold. There, at another register, the man, the child. Mitchell froze, his grip tightening around the small plastic bag in his hand. They weren't gone. They were still here. The man stood near the conveyor belt, tossing a few items onto the counter, water bottles, a couple of snack bars, and a pack of gum. Nothing that suggested a long trip, nothing that suggested a home. Chloe stood beside him, small and silent. Her head was down, her arms wrapped around herself. The contrast was striking, the way her shoulders hunched, the way her tiny frame seemed to shrink beside him. Mitchell had spent a lifetime reading body language. And right now, everything about her screamed fear. Everything about him screamed control. Mitchell swallowed hard. He needed to go. Vera needed him. But as he took a step toward the exit, a single thought anchored him in place. What if I walk away and no one else notices? What if this was the last chance anyone had to stop whatever was happening? The doll in the bag felt heavier than it should have. A decision pressed at the edges of his mind, louder than before. He had a choice to make, and he was running out of time. Mitchell stepped out into the glaring sunlight, his heart beating a little faster than before. His eyes scanned the parking lot, searching. There. The man and the little girl were making their way toward a black sedan. The man walked briskly, his grip firm on her small wrist. The girl struggled to keep up with his pace, her small legs moving hurriedly to match his stride. Mitchell quickened his steps, moving toward them, careful not to appear too aggressive. He wasn't sure what he was going to do yet, but he couldn't just walk away. Then, just as he got closer, the girl looked up. Her expression changed the instant she saw him. A bright, almost relieved smile spread across her face, and before she could stop herself, she waved a small, hopeful flick of her fingers. Mitchell's stomach tightened. That wasn't the kind of reaction a child had toward a captor. That was the reaction of a child seeing a lifeline. Mitchell took a deep breath, closed the last few feet between them, and reached into the bag in his hand. He hesitated for a second, then held out the small, pink-dressed doll. I saw how much she liked this. I thought she might want it. The moment the doll appeared, the little girl's eyes widened. Her hands twitched at her sides as if she wanted to reach for it, but couldn't. For a fraction of a second, pure joy flickered across her face until she turned slightly and caught sight of the man's expression. His gaze had sharpened into something cold. The light in her eyes died almost instantly. She took a small, barely noticeable step back. Mitchell saw it. The silent retreat, the way her shoulders curled inward as if expecting something bad to happen. Her voice was small, fragile. Can I have it?" Before Mitchell could respond, the man's voice cut through the air like a blade. "No!" The word came out harsh, clipped, too forceful for something as simple as refusing a toy. The girl flinched. She hadn't been asking him for permission. She had been asking the man, and she already knew the answer. Her head dipped, her hands retreating into tight little fists. She didn't cry, didn't argue. She simply accepted it, the same way a soldier accepts an order. Mitchell's fingers curled around the doll. He fought the urge to take another step forward, to push harder, to demand answers. Instead, he met the man's gaze, head on. "I don't mean to intrude," he said evenly, "but she really seemed to love this doll." The man's grip on the girl tightened, his knuckles turned white. "That's none of your business," he said sharply. "She doesn't need it." Something about the way he spoke sent a chill down Mitchell's spine. Mitchell tried again. "It's already paid for, no strings attached." The girl lifted her head just slightly, her eyes flicking between the doll and the man beside her. And then, just as quickly, she dropped her gaze again. The man let out an irritated breath, his patience clearly thinning. Without another word, he yanked the little girl's wrist and turned away. "We're leaving." The girl stumbled slightly at the sudden movement, but didn't protest. She didn't even look at the doll again. Mitchell stood frozen for a moment, his pulse hammering in his ears. He watched as the man guided her toward the car, his grip still too firm. He watched as she turned her head one last time, not in rebellion, not in defiance, but with something softer, more desperate. A silent plea. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but no words came. Then the man jerked the car door open, and just like that, she was gone. Mitchell's hands moved before his mind even caught up. He pulled out his phone, dialed, and pressed it to his ear. A steady, calm voice answered on the other end. 911, what's your emergency? Mitchell's grip tightened around the plastic bag in his hand. My name is Mitchell Dawson, he said, voice firm. I think a child is in danger. The flashing red and blue lights cast an eerie glow across the parking lot. Mitchell stood firm, watching as the officers moved with a practiced efficiency. He had done what he thought was right, what his gut had told him to do, but as he faced the skeptical expressions of the police, doubt began to creep in, not about what he saw, but about whether they would listen. The officer in front of him, a middle-aged man with sharp features and weary eyes, flipped open a notepad and looked up. His tone was neutral, but there was a hint of something else beneath it. Skepticism, perhaps even impatience. Did the girl ask for help? Mitchell hesitated for a brief moment, then exhaled. No, he admitted. Not with words. The officer raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Mitchell ran a hand through his graying hair, searching for the right words. She was afraid. I saw it in the way she held herself, the way she reacted when the man told her no. She wanted that doll, but she barely dared to ask. And when she did, he shut her down so fast, it made her flinch. The officer nodded, scribbling something down. Another officer, a younger woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped in. Did you see the man physically harm her? Mitchell's jaw tightened. I saw him grab her wrist too hard. I saw her recoil when he spoke, and I saw the way she looked at me like she was trying to say something but couldn't. The woman exchanged a glance with her partner, the flicker of doubt unmistakable between them. Sir, she said, her voice even but firm, we take these things seriously. But without clear evidence of wrongdoing, there's not much we can do. We can't detain someone just because something feels off. Mitchell clenched his fists. So what, you'll just let them leave? We'll check security footage, run the plates, the officer replied. If there's any record of past incidents, we'll act accordingly. Mitchell let out a sharp breath. And if there's nothing on record? If that man is smart enough to cover his tracks, then what? The woman hesitated, then offered a polite but firm response. We have to follow protocol. Another officer, standing just a few steps away, finally spoke. He was younger, his voice careful, almost hesitant. Sir, I don't mean any offense, but you're a veteran, right? Army? Mitchell's shoulders tensed. Yeah. What does that have to do with anything? The officer shifted slightly, as if choosing his words with care. It's just, sometimes, after seeing a lot, being through a lot, it can make situations seem more intense than they really are, more urgent, more dangerous. Mitchell felt his pulse tick up, frustration burning in his chest. PTSD. That's what they were implying, that he wasn't thinking clearly, that he was imagining things, seeing ghosts where there were none. He had heard it before. The worst part? He understood why they said it, but that didn't make them right. The officers exchanged another glance, one that said they weren't convinced. The female officer sighed. We'll keep an eye out for the vehicle. That's the best we can do for now. The conversation was over. Mitchell turned away, biting back his frustration as he walked back toward the truck. He knew the pattern, but that didn't mean the system was always right. As he reached the truck, Vera was already watching him. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't need to. One look at his face told her everything. She reached for his hand, her fingers warm against his calloused palm. Despite how frail she had become in the last few years, her grip was steady, unwavering. You always had good instincts, she murmured. even when no one else saw what you saw. Mitchell exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. Yeah, well, doesn't mean I can do a damn thing about it. Vera squeezed his hand. Maybe not, but maybe you can. Her voice was soft, but there was an edge to it, a quiet determination, the kind she always carried even in the hardest of times. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Mitchell caught movement. His gaze snapped toward the far end of the lot. There, a black sedan, the same one. Still parked, its brake lights glowing dimly, and through the windshield, barely visible in the back seat, sat the little girl, Chloe. Her small figure was still, too still, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Mitchell's pulse quickened. His fingers curled into a fist. "That's them," he muttered. "That's her." Vera followed his gaze, her sharp eyes narrowing. "Then what are we waiting for?" Mitchell didn't hesitate. He slid into the driver's seat, turned the key, and felt the engine rumble beneath him. The sedan began to pull away. Mitchell eased onto the gas pedal, keeping a safe distance behind them. Not too close. Not enough to be noticed, but close enough. Because if no one else was going to make sure that little girl was safe, then he would. Chloe pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the car window, watching the city disappear behind them. Streetlights blurred into streaks of gold as they passed, buildings giving way to long, empty stretches of road. The farther they drove, the more uneasy she felt. She didn't know where they were going. She only knew they were going far. Her small hands curled into fists in her lap. She tried to keep still, tried not to tremble, but her chest felt tight. She thought of her mother, of her warm hands smoothing her hair at night, of her voice, soft but firm, saying, "If you ever get lost, find someone good, someone who can help." But who could help her now? The man beside her wasn't good. She knew that much. Every time she spoke, every time she asked a question, his fingers tightened around her wrist, just enough to make her stop. Not enough to bruise, but enough to remind her who was in control. Her throat ached as she swallowed hard, trying to fight the fear clawing its way up her chest. Then she thought of the old man in the store, the one who had looked at her like he saw her. Would he still be thinking about her now? Would he know something was wrong? Or had he already forgotten? Mitchell's hands gripped the wheel as he followed the black sedan down the nearly deserted highway. He kept his distance, careful not to get too close, but close enough that they never left his sight. He had made his choice, and now he had to see it through. The city lights faded into the rearview mirror, replaced by long, empty stretches of land. There were fewer cars now, fewer signs of life. The road ahead stretched on, leading toward the border. Mitchell's unease deepened. This wasn't just a bad feeling anymore. This was real. After nearly 10 minutes of driving, the car he was following turned off the main highway, pulling into a dimly lit gas station. Mitchell eased his foot off the gas, slowing down as he approached. The place was nearly empty, just a few trucks parked along the far side, a single gas pump flickering under the weight of buzzing moths. A bad place to stop. Or maybe the perfect place. The black sedan rolled to a stop near the store entrance. Mitchell pulled into a space farther back, just close enough to watch. Inside the car, Chloe sat frozen, staring at the glowing neon sign of the gas station. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. The man pulled out his phone, his fingers moving quickly across the screen. His jaw was tight, his eyes scanning the road ahead. He looked nervous. She had never seen him nervous before. Chloe didn't understand what was happening, but she knew one thing: she didn't want to go any farther. She opened her mouth to speak, to ask one more time if they were going to see her mother. But before she could, the man reached into the center console and pulled out a bottle of water. "Drink," he said, holding it out to her. Chloe hesitated, but when she looked up, his dark eyes were already on her, unblinking. She knew that look. It was the kind that meant no choice. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the bottle. She took a small sip, just enough to make him stop looking at her. But the moment the liquid touched her tongue, a strange heaviness settled in her chest. Her limbs felt slow, sluggish. Her vision blurred around the edges. A thick fog curled inside her mind, pulling her under. She tried to keep her eyes open, tried to fight it. But as her head slumped against the seat, one last thought drifted through her fading consciousness. "I'll never see my mother again." Mitchell watched as the man climbed out of the car and slammed the door behind him. He glanced around the empty station, then walked toward the store, disappearing inside, leaving the girl alone. Mitchell didn't hesitate. Stepping out of his truck, he moved quickly toward the black sedan, his boots crunching against the gravel. His pulse pounded against his ribs. The closer he got, the more the unease in his gut twisted into something sharp. Then he reached the window, and what he saw made his breath catch. The little girl was slumped against the seat, her small body limp. A plastic bottle of cough syrup sat beside her, its cap lying open. Mitchell's stomach dropped. His fingers went for his phone as he turned away from the car, stepping back, his voice steady but urgent as he dialed. 911, came the voice on the other end. "What's your emergency?" Mitchell kept his eyes on the girl, his free hand clenching into a fist. "This is Mitchell Dawson," he said, his voice hard as stone. "There's a child in danger." Mitchell barely had time to react before the man spotted him. Standing near the car, the stranger's body stiffened. His eyes narrowed, dark and unreadable, but the tension in his posture gave him away. He had not expected to see Mitchell again. His lips curled into a sneer, his voice low and venomous. "You again," he spat. "I told you to mind your own damn business, old man." Mitchell didn't move, didn't flinch. He met the man's glare head-on, his stance firm, unwavering. "I can't let you take that girl." His voice was steady, measured, carrying the weight of something undeniable. "The police are on their way. This is over." A muscle in the man's jaw twitched. His grip on the plastic bag in his hand tightened, knuckles turning white. Then, without warning, the man's hand shot to his pocket. The flick of a blade. A small, sharp glint of metal caught the sunlight. Mitchell barely had time to register the movement before the knife was leveled at him, the tip gleaming inches from his chest. "Walk away," the man hissed through clenched teeth. "Now!" Mitchell didn't move, didn't blink. Years of training, of instinct, of experience settled into his bones. He had seen men like this before, men who knew they were cornered, men who lashed out because they had nothing left to lose. Mitchell let out a slow breath, shifting his stance just slightly, weight balanced. "I don't think so." For a second, neither of them moved. Then the man lunged. Mitchell reacted on instinct. He sidestepped the attack, dodging just in time to avoid the swipe of the knife. The blade cut through empty air where his chest had been a second earlier. Before the man could regain his balance, Mitchell grabbed his wrist, twisting sharply. A cry of pain erupted from the man's throat as his fingers spasmed, the knife clattering to the pavement. But he wasn't done fighting. Desperation made men reckless. The stranger threw a wild punch, his free hand swinging toward Mitchell's face. Mitchell ducked, his grip tightening, and in one fluid motion he twisted the man's arm behind his back, forcing him down. A sharp grunt escaped the man's lips as he hit the pavement, his breath knocking out of him. And then, red and blue lights flashed across the lot. A police cruiser pulled in fast, but there was no siren, no blaring noise, just swift, controlled action. 2 officers stepped out, guns drawn, voices sharp and commanding. "Police! Hands where we can see them!" Mitchell didn't let go until he felt the officers take over. A moment later, the man was shoved onto his stomach, wrists locked in cold steel cuffs. He thrashed for a second, but it was no use. One of the officers pressed a knee into his back. "Stay down!" Mitchell took a slow step back, his breath heavy but controlled. It was over, at least for him. But for the girl, his heart pounded as he turned toward the car. Mitchell rushed to the passenger side, where another officer had already opened the door. Inside, the girl was motionless, his stomach clenched. A moment later, the officer leaned in, fingers gently pressing against the child's neck. "She's breathing," he announced, unconscious but breathing. Relief flooded Mitchell's chest, but it was fleeting. Something wasn't right. The girl's head lolled slightly, her body limp. Her small hands, now resting in her lap, looked too still. "She's been drugged," the officer said grimly. "We need medics here, now." The radio crackled. Voices exchanged hurried words. Moments later, the wail of an approaching ambulance cut through the air. Mitchell took a small step forward, gripping the edge of the car door as he looked at the girl's face. She was so small, so fragile. And yet, despite the unnatural stillness of her body, there was something else, something soft in her expression, as though even in unconsciousness, she had found some kind of relief, as if, in the moment before darkness swallowed her, she had felt safe. The paramedics arrived in a blur of motion. A woman knelt beside the open door, carefully assessing the girl before lifting her onto a stretcher. As she adjusted an oxygen mask over the child's nose, one of the paramedics reached for her wrist, checking vitals. Then, something unexpected happened. The girl's fingers twitched, just slightly. Then again, and finally, her small, delicate hand reached out blindly, grasping at nothing, at air, until it found something solid. Mitchell's hand. His breath caught as her tiny fingers curled around his, barrel strong enough to hold on, but unwilling to let go. Even in her unconscious state, she was reaching for him. Mitchell swallowed hard, his own fingers closing gently around hers. A quiet moment passed, the chaos of the scene fading into the background. She didn't know who he was, didn't know his name or where she was, or what would happen next. But somehow she knew he had heard her, that her silent cries had not gone unnoticed, that she wasn't alone anymore. The sirens had faded, the flashing lights of emergency vehicles no longer strobed against the night sky. The chaos, the shouting, the tension, all of it had settled into a quiet hum, leaving behind only the steady murmur of paramedics and officers working around them. Mitchell stood near the open ambulance doors, watching as the little girl lay on the stretcher, her small frame covered with a thin blanket. For the first time, she looked peaceful, safe. And then slowly, she stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, a soft frown creasing her forehead before she let out a weak, tired breath. Mitchell took a cautious step forward. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said, his voice gentle, careful not to startle her. "You're okay now." Her eyelashes lifted, revealing 2 large, glassy eyes that blinked up at him. For a second, she just stared, confusion flickering across her face. Then, hoarse and fragile, her voice came. "Where am I?" "You're safe," he assured her. "The police are here. The bad man is gone." Her lips parted slightly, her throat working as if she wanted to say something but didn't know how. Mitchell knelt beside the stretcher, keeping his movements slow, non-threatening. "Can you tell me your name?" "Chloe," she murmured. "Chloe Parker." Mitchell felt something in his chest tighten. 6 years old, alone, stolen away from everything she knew. The officer standing nearby scribbled something in his notepad before looking up, face grim. "We have a missing person report on Chloe Parker," he confirmed. "Parents reported her missing 3 days ago." 3 days. 3 days of being trapped with a stranger, lied to, manipulated. Mitchell exhaled slowly. "She said something earlier about a new house." The officer nodded. "That's how they trick them. Tell them they're going somewhere safe, that their parents will be waiting." He turned to another officer. "Get her parents on the line. Now." 20 minutes later, a car screeched to a stop outside the station. The doors barely had time to swing open before a woman ran out, her breath coming in sharp, frantic bursts. A man followed close behind her, his face pale, eyes wild with desperation. Mitchell knew before anyone even spoke. Chloe did too. She sat up abruptly, eyes locking onto the woman sprinting toward her. Her small hands clenched the blanket, her chest rising and falling with quick, shaky breaths. Then, suddenly, "Mommy!" The word broke from her lips in a sob, raw and desperate. The woman collapsed to her knees beside the stretcher, gathering Chloe into her arms, holding her as though she'd never let go again. Her fingers ran through her daughter's hair, over her cheeks, as if she had to reassure herself that she was real. "My baby," she cried, voice trembling. "My sweet baby." The father reached them, arms wrapping around both of them, his face buried in Chloe's golden curls. Tears slipped down his face, but he didn't try to stop them. For a long time, no one spoke. There was only the sound of Chloe sobbing into her mother's shoulder, her small fingers clutching at fabric, desperate not to be pulled away again. Mitchell took a slow step back, giving them space. Eventually, Chloe's mother lifted her tear-streaked face, her gaze finding Mitchell. "You," her voice broke, thick with emotion. "You saved our daughter." Mitchell shifted uncomfortably, rubbing the back of his neck. He shook his head. "I was just in the right place at the right time." The woman reached for his hand, gripping it tightly. "No," she said, shaking her head. "You saw her. You listened. You didn't turn away." Her husband stepped forward, his voice rough with barely contained emotion. "We don't even have words to thank you." Mitchell swallowed, looking at Chloe, still wrapped in her mother's arms. She was safe now. That was enough. "You don't have to thank me," he said quietly. "I'm just glad she's home." Chloe lifted her head then, her tear-streaked cheeks still flushed, her breathing still uneven. Mitchell offered her a small smile and reached into his pocket. He pulled out the doll. The same doll from Walmart, the one she had thrown at his feet, the one she had barely dared to hope for. Her eyes widened. Mitchell knelt beside her, holding it out. "I think this belongs to you." Chloe's lips trembled. She reached out with tiny fingers, hesitating for only a second before taking it, pressing it close to her chest. A small, grateful smile crept onto her face, the first real one he had seen. She sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her hand, then looked up at him with wide, shining eyes. "I'll keep it forever," she promised. "That way, I'll always remember you." Mitchell's throat tightened. He nodded, giving her a gentle pat on the shoulder. "That sounds like a good plan, kiddo." As Mitchell and Vera sat in their car later that night, silence filled the space between them. Not heavy, not tense, just quiet. Vera reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. Mitchell glanced at her, then exhaled. "I think..." He hesitated. then spoke the words out loud for the first time. "I think I've found my purpose again." Vera squeezed his hand. "You never lost it," she murmured. "You just found a new way to serve." Mitchell looked out the windshield, his eyes drifting to the station doors, where inside a family had just been made whole again. A deep, steady sense of peace settled inside him. And just like that, Mitchell Dawson found a new purpose, a reminder that doing the right thing doesn't always come with rewards or recognition, but sometimes it means saving a life. A simple choice, a gut instinct, and a moment of courage changed everything for Chloe Parker. And maybe, just maybe, there's a lesson for all of us in that. If this story moved you, if it made you think, don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this, stories of resilience, love, and the power of human instinct, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Remember, heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they're just ordinary people who refuse to look away. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.